I'm Teisha Bader, and in the news, the crisis in Ukraine with the recent invasion on the part of Russia and its assault on the country, which the world is watching with grave concern. Well, to help give us some understanding of what is happening on the ground in Ukraine is Natalia Feduschak, Director of Communications of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, an organization that seeks to strengthen solidarity between Ukrainians and Jews and understanding of Jewish life in Ukraine. Natalia, thank you so much for being here on JBS. I know it's a crazy time.
Yes, it is. It's been several sleepless nights. A lot of news coming in, both from, you have the international news, but then you have news coming from within Ukraine. And of course, grave concern about our family, my husband's family that is in Ukraine. My husband is originally from Kyiv, and so he has family. His mother and his sister and father are there. So it's all, and we have relatives in the West. So it's all quite concerning.
I can't imagine, and I would love to speak about that deep personal connection you have there. But first, if you could just give us a sense of what is happening on the ground. I know you're watching very closely, and I just want to let people know that you've lived in Ukraine for quite a while. You covered Ukraine for some 2 decades. You worked for the Kiev Post. You have an in-depth understanding of the community there. And I know, as you said, you're keeping a very close watch, which is causing many sleepless nights. Can you give us a sense of what you're seeing on television from Ukraine, what you're hearing also from those people on the ground?
Well, on the one hand, what you see internationally is, and I've watched several different sources. I mean, first of all, it's certainly different when you have international media on the ground in Ukraine and speaking about Ukraine and talking to Ukrainians, because for far too long, the news has been, Ukraine has been covered from Moscow or from Washington, and that Ukrainian voice has been missing. And now we have it, and unfortunately, we have it at a time that's critical for everyone. So from the Ukrainian side, what I can say is, yes, I mean, we know that Russian troops are moving in to Kyiv. We know that there is fighting. And if I, speaking from the point of view of my sister-in-law and my father-in-law, I mean, several times a day in Kyiv, they hear the sirens. They had been on the left bank and they went to the center of Kyiv, and thankfully are in a sturdy building that has a hairdressing salon, which and that's where when the air raids come, when the sirens come, that's where they're hiding. And so their conditions are actually pretty good. You cannot now, the subway system is such that it will travel only in the city where the stations are underground. It is now impossible to go to the left bank of Kyiv. The bridges are shut down. And so, they're now on the right bank. They're there. Now, we know that from the Ukrainian news as well, throughout the country, around 800 Russian soldiers have been killed. The Ukrainians are putting up a fight. A lot of young men they're taking up arms and they're fighting for their country. And from what I see both within Ukraine and then international news is that things are not quite going as Putin had planned, because once again, he doesn't understand the Ukrainian mentality. And when I say Ukrainian, this includes both ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Russians. And, you have Russian-speaking people, regardless of their nationality, their ethnic roots, that are fighting and dying for Ukraine. Yes, we're very worried because, Putin will try to install a puppet government, but how he's going to hold the rest of the country is beyond me, because Ukraine is not Russia. And Ukraine is not a fascist state. I'm sorry, the president is Jewish. I mean, Volodymyr Zelensky, has, in my mind, really done a good job in reaching out, to the Ukrainian population. He's been young, very dynamic, and standing firm on Ukraine's European aspirations. And so it's, I could say a lot, but perhaps I'll wait, your next question.
Well, I just want to go back to something you said, because it really, it may sound like a small detail, but it's really huge that you said your family is lucky because they have somewhere to go in a building. It's a hair salon. It's not that there's a bomb shelter. People there do not have so-called safe rooms or bomb shelters. They're just hoping to find a structure that gives some better protection than their own home, I'm guessing. And this is something that is rare to find.
Yes. And people have also, they've had to, conditions vary. There are some basement buildings that are not really not adequate for people to be living in, and yet that's where they have to hide. They've also been hiding in the metro stations. Kyiv, the city itself, has very deep metro stations. So it's not like in New York City where you just will run down a flight of stairs and there's, the A train or, the B train. In Kyiv, you very often, it can take you 5 minutes just to get down to the station level itself. So as shelters, they're good, but no, these are not bomb shelters. These are places where people can hide and protect themselves for a short period of time. And that's about it.
What are you hearing from your father-in-law, from your sister-in-law, as far as what is the atmosphere there? Are they, beyond obviously it being tense, I would imagine that they're very frightened. What kind of emotions are you hearing from them? What kind of?
My father-in-law is in his 80s, and he came from a family, a middle-class working family. And once he told me many years ago, Lenin came to power and we've not been able to stand on our feet since then. So, he saw the Nazis, he saw the Soviets, he thrived in, an independent Ukrainian state that is a liberal democracy that, yes, has had its problems, but the country is 30 years old if we look at modern day Ukraine. And now he's watching the Russians, supposedly brothers. You have to understand, this is supposedly brothers. Our brothers have come in to destroy Ukraine. To destroy Ukraine. And this for him is really quite shocking. My sister-in-law has, and you have to understand that my sister-in-law is primarily Russian speaking. She knows Ukrainian. People in Ukraine are bilingual, Ukrainian, Russian. But the words that come out of her mouth now about Putin in Russian, will make your hair stand. The reality is that Putin has really, he's created a lot of hate where there's, it's nenavist in Ukrainian against Russia and himself. And people, have tried, the Ukrainians have not seen Russians as enemies. And again, when I talk about Ukrainians, I'm talking about citizens of Ukraine. They've not seen Russians as a hostile power. But that's changed now. And there's a big shock that Russia and Russians would do this to Ukrainians. And this is what they're feeling.
Yeah, we saw just the other day a huge demonstration in Russia against the government. Mm-hmm. And there were some 1,800 people arrested because the protest is not covered legally.
Yeah.
And so that must be such a conflicting feeling for your sister-in-law in particular, and so difficult.
Well, the people, I have to say, that came out against Putin's war on Ukraine are to be commended, because that takes courage, because these people then are charged with treason. And the fact that it was in 50 cities in Russia, it gives heart. And President Zelensky made, he twice has appealed to the Russian people. And, he said that he's aware of these protests. They have not gone unnoticed, which shows that not everybody, supports Putin. And those powers in Russia, that public sentiment, that civil society that does exist, needs to be supported as well. And so I can only thank and commend those people for coming out in support of Ukraine at risk to themselves.
How do you feel about what you're seeing from the world response to this crisis, whether it be condemnations from President Biden, whether it be humanitarian aid packages? What is your feeling about how the world is coming to the aid of Ukraine?
Yeah. I want to make it very clear that I'm speaking on my own behalf, not that of our organization. I feel like it's a mixed bag, because on the one hand, you hear that how important Ukraine is to maintaining the world order, how critical it is as a country. And yet Ukraine is being left to fight this battle on its own. Yes, as a US citizen, I'm grateful that our government has sent weapons to Ukraine. I'm grateful that other countries have done that. You have the sanctions that are not immediate. It will be a slow strangulation of the Russian economy. But I can't help but feel that, what we need more, we need more than just, we're so sorry, you're in our prayers. I mean, there needs to be something that really brings Putin and this group of people who are behind him. Something needs to be done that is really more immediate, because, Ukrainians are dying. Ukrainians are terrified. I mean, imagine, one day you're walking along, the sun is out and you think things are great and you're making plans for your life. And the next day, the carpet is taken out from underneath you and your life is turned upside down. On the border with Poland today, I mean, you have families that are being torn apart because men from 18 to 60 now are not allowed to leave Ukraine. And yet wives and children are crossing the border and they don't know if they'll ever see each other again. The hope is, yes, we will, but they may never see each other again. This is 2022. I mean, these are scenes from the Second World War. And yes, it happens in other countries of the world. But it's very hard for me to wrap my head around that this is happening in Europe. We talk about that Ukraine is a European country, and it is. And in many ways, if it has a thriving civil society. I have the real honor of working with great intellectuals and writers in Ukraine, and and artists and musicians, and you have this sense of, wow, this is a country that embodies the European values that people talk about. And now, so it's heartbreaking.
I hear that. I see you, I hear you, and my heart goes out to you and your family. What would you like the world to know that maybe is not being covered in the media right now, that is maybe not being shown in the news? What would you like people to know about what is happening?
Well, it's the Ukrainian story and the Ukrainian history. And, really the idea that Putin thinks that Ukraine is run by Nazis is just so absurd. And And so there are voices, Ukrainian voices that have been speaking abroad, and they've been, talking to an English language audience and trying to speak to a Russian language audience as well. So people there know, this is not okay. I just think that people have to take a very deep breath and think, what are my values? What do I want in this world and in this life? Because, what I will call the latte culture, it will not be business as usual. If Ukraine falls and if he puts in, and I'm hoping that it won't, and Ukrainians are very resilient and they will fight. But the world it's going to be different now, no matter what happens in Ukraine. And so people, I think, have to really ask themselves, what are my values? What do I stand for?
Are you in touch specifically with the Jewish community, or do you hear anything from local Jewish communities there in what they're experiencing?
Well, yes, we have on our website in the next few days. I mean, we're going to be having my colleague Shimon Bremen, who lives in Israel and is from Kharkiv. We're going to be putting up more content from what's happening in Ukraine now, what people are feeling, what the Jewish community is feeling, along with the Ukrainian community, because again, our Ukrainians and Jews have lived on the territory of modern day Ukraine for over a millennium. And these are two people who are very tightly intertwined. But I think that they feel very much what the rest of the country is feeling, because, the Jews who live in Ukraine today, and they are part of this political nation and have been very supportive of building this liberal democracy. And so, in this sense, they're feeling what everybody else is feeling, and the terror and the hope that the rest of the people of Ukraine are feeling.
Well, Natalia, I know this is such a stressful and difficult time. Please know that our thoughts are with you and with your family and with the people of Ukraine, and hoping that this gets resolved as soon as possible with as peaceful a resolution as possible. And we look for you also. If you have any updates, please feel free to let us know. Mm-hmm. And we really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're watching the news constantly. You're on the phone with your family constantly. So thank you for taking time out and sharing your story and what's happening with our JBS audience.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the time and the platform. So.
Our pleasure. Natalia Feduschak is Director of Communications of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. We thank her for taking the time to join us here on JBS. And to give us some perspective on Ukraine from Israel, we are fortunate to have joining us Ambassador Dani Ayalon. Dani served as Israel's ambassador to the United States from 2002 to 2006. He is a former member of Israel's Knesset. He served as Israel's deputy foreign minister and played a leading role in peace negotiations regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the early 2000s. And we are thrilled to have him here on JBS to lend his expertise as we take a look at the Ukraine crisis in regards to the state of Israel. Dani, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on JBS.
Thank you, Teisha.
So Dani, thank you. With your years of experience in foreign policy in Israel, and of course, working for the foreign ministry and working as a diplomat, how are you seeing Israel's response right now to the crisis in Ukraine? What are your thoughts about the response?
Well, Israel is in a bind. So our response has been very calculated, very measured for simply because of our national interests. Today, unfortunately, we border with Russia. Russia is pretty much the owner of Syria. We need this close cooperation with Russia because our Air Force has to have this freedom of operation against Iran, against the Shia militias who are trying to entrench in Syria and make it another base to launch missiles and terror against Israel. So strategic relations with Russia today are very good and very important. On the other hand, Israel has always prided itself to be part and parcel of the Western community in terms of the Western values, Judeo-Christian values. So this is where we are very much appalled by this brutal invasion to Ukraine by Russia. So on the one hand, we have condemned it, and on the other hand, we are not doing it. We don't want to jump to the, let's say, the head of the line. First of all, because of interest, as I told you, and secondly, it's insignificant. Israel is really a small country, and we have not seen much bigger democracies than Israel, condemn in a forthright way. So, and also, and this is what we tell our American friends, it will not mean, or it will not change much. Of course, there is a symbolic, there is a weight here, a moral weight, and of course, we will always be with the United States against the aggression of Russia.
So it is a very interesting and tricky situation, as you said. There was a comment from Ukraine's ambassador to Israel, Yevgen Kornichuk, and he suggested that Israel should do something diplomatically. He said, we are sensitive to the security situation with Russia, to Israel's north in Syria, so we're asking mainly for a diplomatic effort, referring to what you were just speaking about. And the Israeli media has made note of the fact that Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, while saying we stand with Ukraine, has not specifically condemned Russia by name or condemned Putin by name, although Foreign Minister Yair Lapid has done so. So what do you make of that? Is that sort of a common thing where you're hearing condemnation, but in slightly different tones?
Exactly. So I think this is what when I meant measured and calculated. Yes. So we let the foreign ministry do their job, and the prime minister is being much more cautious. And so far it has worked. Whether we will be able to continue, evading the drops, as we say here, I am not sure, because things may come to a head in the United Nations, and if there is a resolution in the assembly, in the General Assembly of the UN, Israel will have to choose. Israel will have to vote. In 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, we had the same dilemma as we do here. Which is actually it's a very ancient dilemma in politics and diplomacy, the conflict between, the built-in almost conflict between morality and interests. Now, in 2014, Israel just did not vote at the General Assembly. Why? We had a very good excuse then, because the foreign ministry was on strike. So no one from Israel was there. And this is how we kind of kept it, let's say we kept a good face in front of everyone and asserted the two sides of the divide. This will not, we will not be able to do it now. The situation in Ukraine is much more serious than what was in Crimea in 2014. And here, Israel will have to take a side. And I would bet that if it comes to a vote in the United Nations, Israel, of course, will be with the US condemning Russia.
And let's talk about the foreign ministry more, because talk about tricky situations. They are now working around the clock to get Israelis out of Ukraine. I don't know what that looks like from a logistics point of view, but it seems incredibly challenging and difficult. And I know you know more about this. Giving out information to people, where to go, which border crossing to go to, what to do when they get there. It seems really very sensitive and very, very complicated. Can you give us an idea of what that picture looks like?
Sure. Well, I spoke today with the Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who used to be a great colleague of mine in Washington. And I told him that this is the finest hour of the foreign ministry, logistically and from a consular point of view. the deployment of the ministry in Ukraine, but also in the countries around Ukraine, is really massive. It's very effective. And today, there are more than 50 Israeli diplomats spread out in the Ukraine, trying to help any Israeli, anyone who needs help to get out of Ukraine. And not only that, they are also positioned in the different border crossings: Ukraine, Poland, Ukraine, Moldova, Ukraine, Romania, or other countries. So once Israelis get into this border crossing, the Israeli diplomats are waiting for them, putting them as a group and working with the local officials of both countries, the Ukraine and the receiving country, to allow them a very speedy and smooth access, entry to this country. And this has been working very well.
It's really quite remarkable. And I just also wanted to mention something that has been stressed by Israeli leaders from the beginning, and that is that Israel's door is open. Israel's door is open to Jews anywhere in the world. And certainly in times of crisis, we really see that foundational mandate that Israel holds so dear really come to the forefront and come to a practical, we're seeing it very practically on the ground.
And Teisha, this is so important. Really, this is the raison d'etre of the state of Israel. Not just to be back in our homeland, but also to be able to give shelter to every and any Jew in the world who is in need. In the Ukraine today, there are no foreign diplomats. All countries pulled their diplomats away except Israel. Israel is the only one there, specifically to help Israelis and Jews who are in need. For instance, that there are Israelis who are married to Ukrainians who are not Jewish. We now make sure that they will be able to come without any bureaucracy that in regular times there are. PCR, corona tests.
Yes.
The Ministry of Health,
diaspora,
right, waived this PCR checks in the Ukraine, so it will be done in Israel. The objective is, first of all, to get them out of the Ukraine. Everything else will be done later. And this is, I think, the strength of Israel and the Jewish people is that in time of need, in time of crisis, we are all one.
Absolutely. Danny, thank you so much. And your perspective is truly valued, and we'll hope for a peaceful resolution to this crisis. And we applaud Israel's foreign ministry, as you said, working day and night to get Israelis out of Ukraine to safety and to help the Jewish community there in particular. Danny Ayalon, former ambassador from Israel to the United States, thank you so much for joining us here on JBS.
My pleasure, Teisha.
And thank you, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, managing director, Dara Golub, our transmissions manager, John McDevitt, technical manager, Michael Paley, and our producer, Carol Lilienthal. And thank you for watching In the News.